Transportation isn't just about getting to work anymore. It's about whether your kid can get to sports practice safely, whether local businesses see foot traffic, whether residents can get across their city without planning the entire day around it. And as Maple Ridge grows, how we move is starting to shape how we live. Big projects are being talked about. Road expansion, bus rapid transit, better connections across the region. But the real question is, how do all of these externally influenced pieces come together with our regional partners to build a city that moves well for everyone? To help us understand how these pieces fit together at a regional level, we're joined by someone who is right at the center of planning the future of transportation in a rapidly growing city and across Metro Vancouver. You're listening to the Real Ridge podcast, where we share the stories behind the headlines on topics that are shaping Maple Ridge. We have a very special guest today. Kevin Quinn is the CEO of TransLink, one of the largest and most complex transportation networks in North America. Welcome to the podcast, Kevin.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, every day, your team is responsible for keeping a region of nearly 3 million people moving across buses, roads, bridges, and an ever-evolving transit system. But beyond the day-to-day operations, you are helping shape what transportation looks like in a region that's growing fast, changing rapidly, and asking bigger questions about how people live, connect, and move. For communities like Maple Ridge, where growth is accelerating and expectations are rising, that work is becoming more visible, more important, and more interconnected than ever. So, Kevin, how do you balance the needs of fast-growing communities like Maple Ridge with the priorities of the entire region?
It's a big question. Communities like Maple Ridge are growing so fast. And, part of our responsibility, honestly, is to keep up. For so long, there's been a sense that a lot of the investments in, say, SkyTrain are going into Vancouver and in Surrey. And the fact is that, Maple Ridge is one of those communities that really is growing fast and that we have to keep up with. And we've seen really changes in travel demand patterns, especially coming out of the pandemic, in a way that we haven't seen in other places in North America. So I think for us, it's really finding a way to balance the needs, those SkyTrain needs, the bus needs, but also keeping a really close eye on fast-growing communities like Maple Ridge and having conversations with you, Mayor, around, new transportation systems like BRT that I'm sure we're going to talk about, but also local bus and bus service that we know Maple Ridge needs as it's growing so fast.
Thank you very much. And thank you for bringing up SkyTrain. I think that sometimes is the elephant in the room, because I hear this a lot from our community that we're end of line and we don't really get the kind of service that we need. And what I keep hearing is, well, why can't we get SkyTrain? So in a nutshell, Kevin, why can't we get SkyTrain?
Yeah. First, SkyTrain is wildly expensive. And here's the thing. This is a region that loves SkyTrain. I mean, to your point, right? You're getting questions about it. I get questions about it all the time. Why can't we bring SkyTrain here or SkyTrain there? The fact is that SkyTrain is very, very expensive and SkyTrain takes a very long time to build. And it also takes up a lot of land, to be quite frank. And I think for our part, we've looked at bus rapid transit as a really good option that can provide the exact same level of service as SkyTrain for a fraction of the cost. And that's where we're putting our efforts because we know that Maple Ridge needs that service today, not 10 or 20 years from now, which is what we would be focused on if that's the direction we were headed.
In a ballpark figure, what's the magic number of population to even consider? Would you have that even in your repertoire?
Yeah, so I don't have that number on me, but you raise a good point, right? There has to be a certain amount of density to really support a high infrastructure, high intensity, rapid rail system. And Maple Ridge very likely doesn't sit with that density today. And that's fine, right? What we want to do is provide a transportation solution that is really tailored for every community. We've rolled out the R3 rapid bus. That's a great connection. I've used that many times myself, and that's a fantastic connection that people are using. Bus rapid transit will certainly connect Maple Ridge down through Langley to the new Surrey-Langley SkyTrain, which is set to open, I think the latest date's 2029, 2030, right? So we think that there can be some really fantastic rapid bus connections that can further connect Maple Ridge into the SkyTrain system that can get you that connection fast. You can make that connection sooner than later.
And absolutely. I mean, we're going to break likely 110,000 population this year. And by 2050, we're looking at about 150,000 population.
Yes.
We have to do something because we can't wait for that to happen and then we're already behind the eight ball when it comes to that. But having said that, there are some strategic road upgrades that can help us while we wait for BRT. Why don't you talk about that?
Well, maybe just a quick backgrounder on TransLink. Most other transit agencies in North America are really set to just provide bus and rail service, maybe some commuter rail. And sure, at TransLink, we have that. We've got bus service. We've got rail service. We have the West Coast Express. We have Handy Dart paratransit service, right? We have a C-bus. We have ferries, right? And that's great. And I'd say that that's what you'd normally find under the umbrella of any transit agency. But what makes us really unique is we do own some roads, and we have the major road network where we, really collaborate with local municipalities and provide cost sharing programs. We have the only dedicated transit police force in all of Canada. No other system has its own dedicated transit police force. That's really interesting. We also coordinate with municipalities like Maple Ridge on the active transportation. We're involved in bike lanes and multi-use paths. And chances are, if you see a bike lane or a multi-use path anywhere in Metro Vancouver, there's probably some TransLink funding in there. So we're really involved in transportation writ large from a multimodal perspective. And so to your point, in Maple Ridge, certainly we also own bridges, and we own the Golden Ears Bridge, and we also own the Golden Ears Way. It's actually the one road that TransLink owns, which is kind of fascinating, right? And so we have certainly heard from Maple Ridge elected officials and residents for quite some time the traffic issues that are on Golden Ears Way. And so we were really happy to work with you, Mayor, and allocate funding in our budget for this year to try to make that project happen, right? That we have funding in the budget to make it happen. We're going to go through all the processes that we need to go through to get that through the permitting phase and all the work there that needs to happen. But that's a much needed project that I think that road widening that currently, as you well know, is so constricted is going to be game-changing improvement for Maple Ridge.
And that's all the way up to 2/10.
That's right.
That's really interesting. And I know my listeners want to know how committed TransLink is. We've heard it before that, oh yeah, it's a done deal. And yet here we are years later and it's still not a done deal. So how committed, where are we in that process?
Yeah, so TransLink is absolutely committed to that project. Our concept design is finished. We need to go through some consultation processes, some permitting processes, and we're going to move that as fast as we can. But we have the funding. A lot of these projects, we go through a lot of plans. Look, we're TransLink. We talk a lot about plans. We want to get some things done. And the fact is, we've moved past the planning stage. There's funding in the budget to make this happen. We're going to make this happen.
And I have to say, we met earlier today and I got a sneak peek at the concept drawings, and I know people are going to be excited that this is becoming a reality. So thank you for your work on that. Let's talk a little bit about BRT. BRT, or bus rapid transit. I'm not sure yet, as much as we keep telling people what it is. I keep hearing we're losing 2 lanes on Lougheed Highway. Let's jump into BRT. What is it? Why is it? And what are the mechanics of it?
So BRT is really characterized by a few things. It's essentially a type of technology, a type of service that's really been used around the world for a number of decades now. And probably many of your listeners have experienced bus rapid transit in other countries. It's not something that we've really done a lot here in Metro Vancouver. But, really what you'd have is fast, frequent service, right? So a service that's coming every 5 or 6 minutes. So in a way, it operates on a rail-like schedule. It's also characterized by more rail-like stations. So for a bus system here in Metro Vancouver, folks might be more familiar with just a bus shelter. We're not talking about a bus shelter. We're talking about more like a station with station-like amenities, real-time signage, benches, things like that. And then also transit priority measures along the corridor, things like dedicated bus lanes, queue jumps, transit signal priority where the buses are communicating with traffic signals, right? So take that bus system, the bus that today, folks, and, upgrade it, put it on steroids, right? It's super fast, it's super reliable, and it's, again, we think it's going to be a game changer. Our 10-year plan originally identified 9 BRT corridors, and working with our mayor's council, we've narrowed that down to 3 BRT corridors. One of those is, of course, Langley up to Haney Place. And so we've been moving forward, and we're at about 30% concept design on that sitting there today.
I remember when we started this whole conversation and I went to Montreal to look at their new BRT. Having been born and raised in Montreal myself, we got on it, and what we saw were 2 lanes of traffic, bumper to bumper, literally miles connected. It was not moving. we got on the BRT and you were like literally waving to cars as you go by because there were no interruptions.
That's right.
That's the advantage of BRT. But for someone who rarely takes transit, why would they care about BRT?
Well, I mean, first off, they may want to take transit, right? Once a new BRT is in place that is bypassing all that traffic, folks might want to reconsider. They probably will reconsider what their commute looks like with a brand new service available to them that's coming every few minutes, that's reliable. Secondly, road users should certainly want this. It takes more people off the road, right? Less cars equals less congestion. And so, Maple Ridge does see its fair share of congestion. And so the more folks can get on transit. And look, transit's not for everyone and every trip, right? But there are a lot of trips that people are making today that they can and will be able to make on transit in the future.
Certainly, we've seen in other cities in the States, for instance, 2 years after the BRT launched, there was an influx of medical clinics, chiropractors, any kind of medical clinic along that corridor started popping up. Housing started popping up, and it allowed for a complete redevelopment of that main transit corridor. So I believe we'll have about 4 stops along that corridor. And what this will do is allow people short trips, get on, get off, get on, get off, and know that the transit is going to be there reliably, whether it's 5, 6, 7 minutes, whatever that timing might be. But it takes time to build that. And when we look at that, I just want to clarify, people think it's a bus. The bus lanes are one thing, but what makes it so unique with the buses?
I think what's always striking and unique about BRT for me is the station side of things. And you were getting to it, right? This idea of private development coming up. One of the criticisms that you'll often hear about BRT is that it's not a rail station, right? It's not a rail station. And I think what's been shown really worldwide is that where you provide that reliable, rapid service and a station footprint, private investment and development will come. And so you noted health facilities. So the Cleveland Health Line is a BRT that's well known for generating hundreds of millions of dollars across a BRT corridor for hospitals and other health facilities that have popped up. That BRT is now the spine for an entire health corridor in the middle of a city, right? That's a fascinating economic development result that's happened with that BRT investment. And I think what's been shown, that's probably a large example, but even in smaller communities, you see people start to develop housing around those stations and more economic development come in and private investment. So it really can spur investment. And, I'll also just note that there's other systems and critics who say, BRT, it's not rail. Well, this also doesn't preclude rail. You noted earlier, some of your listeners might be saying, well, I may not want this. I want SkyTrain or I want some sort of light rail system. Guess what? We're laying the groundwork for it. BRT also doesn't preclude that. And we'll be looking at building these stations in such a way that, maybe there is rail in the future. We don't know. Who knows? The folks that are doing a podcast 100 years from now, what kind of system will they be saying? Will they be saying, we need to be building a SkyTrain system? I don't know. But BRT isn't the end. It's just one more product, if you will, of moving people that can always evolve.
Okay. So earlier you said SkyTrain planning could take a decade, if not longer, and then getting it up and running and so on and so forth. As a politician myself, I often hear and see the notion that it should be up and running. Snap your fingers and up and running. Obviously, a lot longer to do with SkyTrain, but with BRT, what's involved with that? So I know we've got designs now to 30%, but what else is involved with that? That is going to take 2 or 3 years to get up and running.
So step number one is we've got to have funding for it, right? We've got to have funding. And so, certainly we are working with the Mayor's Council and advocating to the provincial and federal governments for funding. There may be hope along the way. The federal government has the Canada Public Transit Fund, and I think we're hoping to access some of those funds. So, step number one is we've got to have funding. In the meantime, we know that this is such a priority that we're still moving forward with advancing design. So some of that design work, taking it from 30% to 100% design, that takes time. It doesn't take as much time as SkyTrain. And I think that's what's always important is putting it in perspective, right? The Surrey Langley SkyTrain is going to take $5-6 billion and 10 plus years to make happen. It's a long time. I don't know. Maybe Maple Ridge can wait.
No, we can't.
10 plus years and we can wait for $6 billion to magically appear. But I don't think that's what you want.
No, absolutely not.
And That's not what your residents want. That's not certainly what TransLink wants, right? We want to get a solution out the door as fast as possible. And again, what we see is transportation is about moving people, right? And what moves people is a service that's coming at a certain frequency and a certain reliability. We can provide a SkyTrain rail-like service with, a bus with dedicated lanes without taking lanes away from traffic. I don't know. It sounds like a pretty good solution to me. And that comes certainly sooner than a SkyTrain.
So what stars have to align to make that happen? The second elephant in the room, you stated it right at the beginning of this one.
Threw that elephant right in the room, just threw the grenade.
Threw it in the room, was funding. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that. Where does this funding come from, and from what does it apply to? So right now, we're up to 30% designs. So who's paying for those designs? Do we have funding for that?
Sure. Yes. So we do have full funding for the design. So the Mayor's Council came together with the 2025 investment plan to fund the design work for the 3 BRT corridors, the Metrotown to the North Shore and King George Boulevard in Surrey and Langley to Haney Place. And so the Mayor's Council made a big investment in BRT, allocating around $20 million to finish all 3 corridors, get them through design, all the design work that needs to be done. We're advancing that as fast as we can and doing a lot of really good public engagement, which is also something I just want to note for a second, because at the beginning of the year, we did a ton of public consultation and public engagement. And, something that I think shocked all of us is that we found that 84% of residents either supported or highly supported BRT in their community, right? I don't know if, as you go out, if you can find 84% of people willing to agree on much of anything these days.
It's not easy.
Right? But to have communities come forward and 84% of them say, yes, this will help my community move better. This will help me on my daily commute. I don't know. That's pretty powerful. And so as we certainly talk to senior levels of government about construction for funding, it is a win-win-win for everybody to see these BRTs happen.
Okay, so $20 million, and I know my listeners are going to say, $20 million for planning? That's crazy. But it's not somebody drawing on a napkin. These are detailed designs, and there's so much involved. Like Langley is a clear path most of the way down, but in Maple Ridge, there's some hurdles you have to get through, of which some is acquiring some corners of properties, so on and so forth, and making sure that, the route is defined properly. Then now we come to who's involved. So TransLink is doing the designs, but along the R corridor, it's a provincial right-of-way. So how did that work?
A lot of coordination, a lot of conversations, trying to find a middle ground with everybody between TransLink and a product we want to deliver, certainly the city of Maple Ridge, and what you want it to look like, and knowing your community inside and out, better than TransLink does, but then also the road owner, the Ministry of Transportation and Transit, right? The province owns that roadway. So we've also got to have that coordination with the province. And so, what does take time is the coordination of those 3 parties and landing on a design solution and being sure that we also do very careful evaluation. What are the property impacts? What are the traffic impacts, right? We don't want to roll out a product that doesn't work, or that suddenly you're getting calls because, everyone is jammed up in traffic now, right? Like, we need to have a design solution that works for everybody.
Yeah, and I know that our people and your people and their people are in constant contact, and we don't always agree. My ultimate vision, our ultimate vision, is slightly different from your vision because, I understand you want to get it rolling. You want to get it up and running so that we can start moving forward. And we're looking at, what does that ultimate picture look like? Is it MUPs? Is it bike lanes? So those are pieces that we're still working through, and, we're committed to trying to find common ground with those solutions. But now the biggest one is designs are funded, but the actual capital costs, the actual construction costs are not funded. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And that's, again, where we're really advocating to senior levels of government to get that funding. We anticipate that, within roughly 3 to 4 years of having that funding, sort of depending on when that funding becomes available and construction windows, we should be able to roll out this BRT.
What I don't understand, what my listeners won't understand in all of this is BRT checks off a lot of the boxes. Moving people, moving goods, unclogging up congestion on the streets, population increase, housing and economic diversification. It checks off all the boxes. why are we having so many challenges getting our senior levels of government to actually commit to funding? Because this even checks off the climate change portion of it. Why is it so difficult to get them to commit?
Yeah, that's a really big question. It's a really great question. You know, back in 2021, the government announced the Canada Public Transit Fund, right? And we sit here today, as of right now, with none of that having rolled out. We haven't seen a penny of that. That was a $30 billion fund that, was set up for the whole country. To your point, our 10-year plan is $30 billion. We could use that fund here in Metro Vancouver all ourselves, and that was allocated for the whole country. The last few years, we have been pushing hard for the federal government to roll out that program much faster. I remember going to Ottawa in 2022 and
I was there too.
Meeting with elected officials and saying, hey, we can't wait 5 years. Well, here we are 5 years later, and that funding still hasn't rolled out, much to, I think, my frustration, a lot of people's frustration, right? Communities need that help now. We need transportation projects now. And the other thing is, just because the funding becomes available again, nothing actually rolls out to the public for several years. Right? Even if that funding rolled out today, it's several years before people see that improvement, which is why we were advocating for it to roll out. I was just in Ottawa a few weeks back with Mayor Brad West and, advocating to senior levels of government, to the federal government, especially around this connection between housing and transportation, and noting that, this federal government has set out some really good, very ambitious goals around housing and affordability and economic competitiveness and energy independence and all the things that you noted, right? Do we have the amount of infrastructure investment to meet those very ambitious goals?
No, we don't.
And I think probably where I stand on this, which is no, we don't. And we need more funding, and we need it to roll out faster. And so that was a big part of our push, is increase the amount, make it so it can roll out faster and index it to inflation. What we find is that the amount that was announced in 2021 has 30% less purchasing power from inflation alone. So that amount of funding needs to be bigger for around the country. And, we've all got to collectively come together to push the federal government and the provincial government to invest in these community building projects.
So over the last 3.5 years, we've all been sitting back and counting on that transit funding that was always announced. And now we're actually, if I'm correct, they've actually cut the amount of funding that's there, which it boggles the mind. But I don't want to just put everything at the foot of the federal government, because they are giving money. Where does the province fit in here?
Yeah. So, certainly we've been working with the province through the past few investment plans. The federal government's perspective is we don't participate in operating budget. It's purely for capital projects. And so as far as the province goes, I think it's a little bit of both. It's operating and capital. The revenue and the revenue sources that TransLink brings in is fully controlled by provincial legislation. So I don't have an ability to unilaterally come up with some sort of new revenue source that the region has to pay, right? The province, through law, has to introduce and amend TransLink's legislation to introduce new revenue source. So on the operating side, we've certainly been working with them on revenue sources and how we can better fund our organization. But the province also has goals around housing and affordability and economic competitiveness and all those good things where they need to put up some capital funding as well. These are projects that help build the province and that help move people in the province. And so certainly working the Mayor's Council, we've been advocating to them as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned housing targets. Certainly the province has, some would say, come heavy-handed when it comes to those housing targets. However, we've surpassed our housing targets for year one, and we're on track for year two. So we're doing our part. It's frustrating because, yes, we are end of line. You go to other communities, be it Burnaby or Vancouver or Coquitlam, and they have it all. They have SkyTrain, they've got rapid buses, they've got all sorts of transit, and it's easy to not own a car. And there was a survey that came out not too long ago that said that the money that's saved from living out in Maple Ridge, because we are a little bit more economical when it comes to housing, is actually exceeded by the transportation cost. So you're forced to have a car here.
Mm-hmm.
And my residents are frustrated because they're spending money when they don't need to spend money. So when we talk about making sure that we have enough transit, making sure that the BRT is online, which we need the province and the federal government to step up, it's in everybody's best interest. It's about moving people along, moving people forward. But when we talk about things like, how do we make this happen? How do we get governments to deliver on that? And That's the biggest frustration I've had throughout all of this. And this is one of the reasons why when we talk about this, when we do these podcasts, it's about informing, educating, and helping people understand the process that's involved with all of this. And I do want to thank, TransLink for all the work that they do. One of the funds that they have, that you have, is the Major Road Network, which in part is funding for the Golden Years expansion. But funding goes to every municipality to help improve their major road network. Maybe just quickly talk about that.
Sure. TransLink has a bit of a funding and a regulatory role around the major road network. So that's a real bureaucratic way of saying that we have some policy levers, if you will, over all of those roads that feed into the provincial highway system. So you've got your provincial highway system. There's all the arterials that feed into that. And so TransLink has a funding role where we provide funding to municipalities, over $100 million a year to municipalities to do road upgrades and repaving and maintenance and active transportation. So you asked the question earlier, why should a non-transit user kind of care about this? Well, to be fair, their tax dollars are going to TransLink, which in turn goes to Maple Ridge to help keep those roads paved and in good condition, right? That's funding that comes through TransLink, but comes ultimately back to Maple Ridge. And so we're trying to, if you will, get that word out more of the role that we play. A lot of people think of us as just buses and trains and, West Coast Express, right? But we're not just that. We're roads and bridges and Golden Years Way and all of these pieces and, in a way that we connect. If I can kind of loop back to your housing comment for a second, because I think before we leave that, I just want to note that, these housing targets that have been set and the investment that municipalities are now having to make in housing, I think we can all look at that and recognize that, sure, we need more housing in this province, right? We need more affordable housing for folks. But a failure to also recognize that transportation side of things, right? We talk a lot about TOD, right? Transit-oriented development. Well, if all the attention is going on development and we build all this housing, but we have failed to focus on transportation, those costs for those families that you're talking about, they're just going to stay the same or they're going to go up, right? We have to have equal investment in transportation as we do in housing. And I think, part of our advocacy to policymakers is helping them understand that these cannot be spoken about in siloed ways anymore. It's not just a transportation conversation and a housing conversation. It's both, because guess what? The number 1 and 2 expenses for every family in Metro Vancouver is housing and transportation. You can't just talk about it as one or the other anymore. Oh, we'll invest in housing this year, transportation next year. No, these two go together because they go together for every family's budget. So we got to stop talking about them as separate things.
I agree with you 100%. Like I said earlier, it checks all the boxes out.
Yeah.
And when we look at even the potential for development along that low heat corridor, the amount of housing that we could put there, where we already have services, we already have pipes and sewers and water. So instead of continuing urban sprawl, we can focus on that downtown core and build it up and get more people living there that actually can serve the businesses that are there. And so this is where it all comes together. And that's been my frustration, is we don't recognize that. We don't look at transit as future-proofing it.
That's right.
And it's not. We're like, here's a cookie for you, sir. Thank you very much. But even now, when we look at one of our biggest revenue generators, it used to be the gas tax. What's happening with that?
Metro Vancouver is one of the highest adopters of electric vehicles in all of North America. That's great. I've got nothing against EVs. It's problematic when you base the funding of a transit system on people buying more gas and not using an electric vehicle, right? So, certainly what we've asked the province to do is rethink that model. Again, they control our funding sources. And so we've asked them to take a look at that. To your point, that gas tax is a rapidly declining revenue source for TransLink.
So then how do we replace it?
Well, certainly pushing the province to look
at
new
in the room.
Yeah, new revenue sources, right? Is there another revenue source that could come online? And I think that that's something that certainly the province agreed to introduce as part of the 2025 investment plan and the agreement and negotiation that took place. We're very hopeful and cautiously optimistic that those plans are moving forward. Think about running a business, right? And imagine that, your books only show revenues for the next couple of years. What kind of decisions do you make? Do you continue to invest? Do you not invest? It's no way to run a business. and certainly no way to run the transportation system of one of the largest regions in Canada.
Staying along the lines of revenue, I grew up in Montreal. Montreal has the metro system underground, connects everywhere. There is such a well-defined transit system. When we come to here, we're not at that point. We need to get to that point. But one thing I hear a lot is, and we've made concessions, if you're, I think it's under 5, you don't have to pay to get on there.
So if you're a student 12 and under, you ride for free.
12 and under. Yeah. Okay. There you go. 12 and under. How does that affect students, for instance?
It's a program that was put in place several years ago. There have been calls for free transit. And, I think from our perspective, it's a lot about the revenue, right? So that's $400 million that has to be made up every single year to say, make transit free.
That's under 12. That's what it's costing transit.
No, sorry. So for 12 and under is a much smaller amount, but sometimes you get calls for free transit for the whole system. And that's, fares essentially you'd be removing from our budget is anywhere from 4 to...
You mean all fares? Just completely free?
If you said, Kevin, I want fares to be completely free, I'd say, okay, well, then that's great. I just need a check for $400 or $500 million every single year going forward. That's what that would equal, right? There have been calls lately for a low-income transit pass. And, that's something that we've been talking about for quite some time. We submitted a report to the Mayor's Council a few years ago supporting such a concept. So the province today has a pass called the BC Bus Pass. That is essentially a low-income pass, but it essentially requires you to be on some level of provincial income assistance, as well as to be, I think it's a senior or someone with a disability, right? So you have to meet a number of qualifications. But, to be clear, the income threshold to be on low-income assistance is pretty low. It's like $20,000 to qualify for that. So in other words, you could be making $40,000 a year in this province, and you don't qualify for that. And so there's been lots of calls for a low-income transit pass that sort of raises that income threshold that also maybe takes away that restriction that you have to be a senior as well or someone with a disability. So I think for our part, look, we support that. That's a provincial program. And I think our financial position right now isn't one that we don't have such a program and we don't have the financial position to take on such a program. We did submit a report to the Mayor's Council several years ago that included a letter to the province that strongly encouraged them to take a look at a low-income transit pass and to make those adjustments.
So, and I think I'm on the same page with you when it comes to low-income fares. Is that a function of TransLink? Because where do we get the money from? If we're foregoing a set of income streams for doing that type of service, why would that fall on to the transit authority? Because how do you replace it?
That's exactly right. So we would look to the provincial government to either provide the funding, the replacement funding. I mean, to a point you made earlier, right? We've got to keep those buses running. Like I've got to pay drivers. 86% of TransLink's budget goes towards frontline services of bus operators, SkyTrain mechanics, transit police. The bulk of the funding is all what people see every day. Those buses, those trains, the C buses, the West Coast Express. That's what it's all about, right? You can't just remove that funding coming in through fares and not replace it with something. And so to your point, I think we would look to the provincial government to replace that funding somehow. We got to keep paying the bills. We got to keep paying bus operators. That obligation doesn't go away when you implement a low-income transit pass.
And for sustainability, we need to have a long-term thinking plan. You don't take care of BC Ferries, do you?
No, we do not. We're going to let BC Ferries handle their own.
But for the purpose of this conversation, there's a great example of you have to plan for more ferries, whether they be to increase service or whether they be to replace the ferries that are breaking down. It's much bigger cost in their case. And when it goes down, you see the impact it has. TransLink, when one bus goes down, you're likely able to get another one in the queue pretty quickly. When there's a stoppage somewhere, you get a whole bunch of the buses that go out there and they pick up people off the SkyTrain and then they ship them to the next station. That is part of the planning that's in there. And I think you do that very well. But I'm always concerned about what are the next 20 years, 30 years, and we'll leave that one at that. And, again, I think of where that revenue stream comes from, because when we put out our property tax notices, unfortunately for municipalities, we also collect taxes for TransLink, for Metro, for water, for drainage, and for schools. And so we bear the brunt of that, no matter how big or how small our tax increase. And we put through a 3.5 increase. folks don't always get that there's other agencies that are also part of those property taxes. So I'm going to say this right now. We cannot increase revenues by more property taxes. Property tax owners, especially in Maple Ridge, where 93% of our tax base is residential, they can't bear anymore. So we have to find a better way of doing this. And I guess the question, the more of a philosophical one, when we look at transit, is it supposed to be a private entity making money, or is it a government-led organization that plans for the future, plans not for 2 years down the line, as you said, but plans for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? We talk about 2050, we're going to have 150,000 people here. I can't all of a sudden in 2048 say, hey, what are we going to do now? We need to be having those conversations now. And if you can't plan for the future, then you're not growing the system. And that's the problem that we're seeing across the board, whether it be for e-com, whether it be for Metro. You know, I'm veering off a bit here, but Metro just introduced level 3 restrictions. People are hopping mad about this. And the one comment I keep hearing is, why didn't we invest in more reservoirs? And there's going to come a point, and it's actually already here, why didn't we invest in more transit? That's the real question.
Hey, look, you're preaching to the choir here. This is certainly, I sit here on behalf of TransLink, an organization that wants to invest. And, to what kind of organization TransLink is, there is no transit agency in North America that is a money-making entity, right? Transit is not here to make a profit. Transit is here to provide a service and to move a region and get people to jobs and get kids to school. And we are critical, essential infrastructure. We are economy-moving infrastructure. We are not a profit-making business, right? Your point's well taken on the property tax side of things. We really do focus on a bit of a philosophical beneficiary kind of paying model, right? Transit riders should pay their fair share. They are benefiting from transit. Drivers benefit from transit, and whether that's the roads they're driving on or whether that's the congestion that is reduced when people take transit, right? Drivers are benefiting. Property owners are benefiting. When they have good transit service, their property values go up. That's what we've seen. Many other systems do also take a look at a general public type of a beneficiary, whether that's a sales tax, to be honest, all throughout the United States, every year. Dozens and dozens of cities and municipalities and states are passing sales taxes. Down just south of us in Seattle, they've passed 3 consecutive sales tax increases to fund $30 billion of light rail construction. There's a way to do it. All of this infrastructure doesn't come for free, but it is to provide that public good. It is to provide, opportunities for housing to be built around transit to have a more sustainable region. And you're probably accurate to note that we're quite at a precipice here where those projects of the future need to start rolling.
Yeah, I agree. And, if there was a magic silver bullet, I don't know what that is. But I know that every household plans their household around the future. You buy a little starter home, you get married, all of a sudden you have a kid, you have a second kid, the house is no longer big enough for you, so you upgrade that house. But you plan for it. You put money into a savings account because you know that you're going to have a bigger family, so you want to be able to buy a bigger home. Granted, homes are expensive today, but you still have to plan for it. It's not something you wake up one day and say, hey, honey, let's go buy a house. And it seems sometimes it's like our senior levels of government are saying, hey, honey, let's put another bus on the road. And let's just quickly talk about that because there's a very good positive thing that happened this year with increased buses. Talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. Part of that 2025 investment plan and the investments that were made included a 5% increase in bus service. That's the largest increase in bus service that we have seen in 10 years. That's incredible. A lot of those services and frequency improvements we've rolled out have been in Maple Ridge, right? Specifically services running a wider span of service. So, something we've heard in particular are shift workers, right? They're not working a 9 to 5. They need to catch that bus at 4 or 5 in the morning. They're getting home 10, 11, 12 at night, right? So people aren't working traditional 9 to 5s anymore. And we have to have a service that accommodates that schedule, right? And so a lot of the changes that we've made to many routes in Maple Ridge include span of service as well as some frequency improvements, buses coming more frequently. So that's been a great investment coming out of the investment plan. As of this September, we'll have about 75% of those new route changes of that 5% will be rolled out as of September with additional more to come.
Yeah, and if there's one big takeaway for listeners is you increase bus routes, you increase frequency, you're increasing the cost because now you need another driver. You need another bus, right? Where are the potential savings? In Maple Ridge, we started flipping our fleet over to hybrid or electric vehicles. And there's a huge cost savings on gas. Sorry, they're not contributing to the gas tax anymore, but there's a huge savings that way. Where are we on initiatives like that?
So I think you rightly pointed out electrification is one where we see some long-term operational savings for sure. There's a lot of capital money needed. There's a lot of money to build out the facilities. We can't just order buses and have nowhere for them to charge. So what we have to do is take existing depots a lot of times, and we're going to have to retrofit them and redesign them so that they're appropriate to charge battery electric buses. But you're right. When you look out in the long run, there's tremendous savings to our budget by running electric buses. I'll say especially right now, fuel as a result of what's going on globally is very volatile. That is impacting our budget. And so the less we can be reliant on gas and on diesel, oh my gosh, the better we will all be.
Which brings another one. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, maybe a year and a half ago, the federal government announced the purchase of 100 or 200 electric buses for a municipality back east. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but they're not paying for the operation of that. And if that municipality, the greater municipality, now they have to increase the people to run those. And of course, when they switch them over, what happens to the older vehicles? Do they go? Do you sell them? What do you do with those older vehicles?
First, we try to run them into the ground. We run those buses as long as we can safely run them so that we get as much useful life out of them as we can. I'll note that, the useful life of a bus is about 12 to 14 years. We run our buses about 20 to 21 years.
12 years?
Yeah, 12 years for a bus.
Short? Why so short?
It's the standard that the bus is built to. We run our buses much longer, and that's a testament to the great work at the Coast Mountain Bus Company and the maintenance folks there, that they have learned how to keep a bus going for 20 years, maybe when it's not supposed to be going for 20 years, right? Yeah, but that keeps costs down. Like, let's be clear, that is a cost efficiency. That keeps costs down and keeps the number of buses that we are buying as low as possible, which is a benefit to the taxpayer, right? And that's what we're always thinking about.
In an ideal world, all levels of government would make this a permanent cost, because as we continue to grow, as I said before, 2050, 150,000 population, I can't put another 30,000 cars on the road here without doing something to compensate for that. Kevin, this has been an interesting conversation. We could sit here for another hour and talk, but I'll close off with this. As Maple Ridge grows, transportation becomes less about one project and more about how everything connects. In the end, it's not just about getting from A to B. It's about building a city where people can move, connect, and live well, no matter how they choose to go around. And, if anything, my listeners today can feel good about is there's a lot of us that are working towards that. There's a lot of us that are planning for the future, that are looking down 10, 20, 30 years from now. And the Access for Everyone 10-year plan, it's ambitious for sure. But if you're not ambitious, then you're not going to get anywhere. So I want to thank you for taking the time to come in and speak to us today, and looking forward to the Golden Years expansion, looking forward to more news for the BRT. We saw the concept designs for that. It's exciting, and it's a game changer. All those things are a game changer for Maple Ridge. So thank you for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be a partner. Thanks.
Thank you.